was finished. Her son was dead. She had watched it happen. She had stood at the foot of the cross for hours and watched the life leave the body she had carried, fed, raised, and loved for 33 years. And now it was Friday evening. The sun was going down, and in a few hours, the Sabbath would begin. The holy day when no work could be done, when nothing could move, when the whole world of her people would stop. Her son's body had been taken down and laid in a borrowed tomb. A heavy stone had been rolled across the entrance. Roman soldiers had been posted to guard it. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, had to do something almost no one ever talks about. She had to survive the next 3 days. 60 hours. From the moment the stone sealed the tomb on Friday evening to the moment it was found rolled away on Sunday morning. 60 hours in which the most famous mother in history was simply a grieving woman who had just buried her child and did not yet know that anything was going to change. We remember the cross. We remember the resurrection. But almost no one ever asks what happened in between. What did she do? Where did she go? Who was with her? How does a mother survive the 3 days her son is in the grave? Built from the Gospels, from Jewish burial and mourning customs of the first century, and from the earliest traditions of the church. This is the story of those 60 hours, hour by hour. The longest, darkest, quietest 3 days of her life. It begins at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the moment he died. The Gospels tell us Jesus died at the 9th hour, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they tell us exactly who was standing there when it happened. The Gospel of John names them. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, and the disciple John himself. A mother does not leave. While the crowds mocked and the soldiers gambled and most of his followers fled and hid, his mother stood there. For hours, she would not look away. She would not abandon him. She had been there at his first breath in a cave in Bethlehem, and she would be there at his last breath on a hill outside Jerusalem. And before he died, her son had spoken to her. In the middle of his own agony, he had looked down and seen his mother, and seen the young disciple John beside her, and he had said, "Woman, behold your son," and to John, "Behold your mother." With some of his final breaths, he had made sure she would be cared for. In that world, a widow with no son to provide for her had nothing. And so, even as he was dying, he gave her a new son and gave John a mother. So Mary did not only watch her son die. She received, in his dying words, a final act of a son's love, the assurance that she would not be left alone in the world. It was the last thing he ever gave her before the end. And then he was gone. The sky had been strange and dark for hours, and at the 9th hour, her son cried out one last time and died. Imagine that moment for her. The thing Simeon had warned her about 33 years earlier, when her son was just 40 days old, and she brought him to the temple. A sword will pierce through your own soul also. That sword had now gone all the way through. But here is what almost no one thinks about. Even in that moment of total devastation, Mary could not simply collapse and grieve. Because the clock was running. The sun was going down. And in the Jewish world, sunset on Friday meant the Sabbath was about to begin. And once it began, a dead body could not be touched, moved, or buried until it was over. They had only a few hours. If her son's body was not buried before sunset, it would have to hang there, exposed, through the entire holy day. For a grieving mother, that was unthinkable. So even in her grief, the practical, terrible work of burial had to begin immediately. And Mary, who had spent her whole life doing the quiet, necessary work that no one noticed, now had to do the hardest work of all. But before we follow him, stay one more moment in the 9th hour with her. Because there is a detail in the Gospels that we rush past, and it belongs to her. When her son finally died, the Gospels record strange and terrible things. The sky, dark since noon. The veil of the temple, the great curtain that separated the holiest place, torn from top to bottom. The earth itself shaking. To everyone else in Jerusalem, these were frightening omens. But to Mary, standing at the cross, they would have meant something else entirely. That heaven itself was reacting to the death of her son. That the whole creation was grieving with her. And yet, even as the world convulsed, the practical, unbearable demands of the next hour pressed in. A body needed to be claimed. A tomb needed to be found. The Sabbath was coming. There was no time to simply collapse into grief. Mary, who had spent 33 years doing the quiet, necessary work that held a family together, now had to summon, one last time, the strength to act. And then a man stepped forward, whom almost no one expected. His name was Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man, a member of the Jewish ruling council, the same council that had condemned Jesus. But secretly, the Gospels tell us, he was a follower. And now, with extraordinary courage, he went publicly to the Roman governor Pilate and asked for the body. This was dangerous. To ask for the body of a man executed for claiming to be a king was to mark yourself as his associate. Joseph risked his position, his reputation, possibly his life. But he did it. Pilate granted the request, and a second man joined him, Nicodemus, who had once come to Jesus secretly at night. He brought an enormous quantity of burial spices, myrrh and aloes, the Gospel says, about 100 Roman pounds worth, a staggering royal amount, the burial of a king. And here is a detail that would not have been lost on Mary. Myrrh, the same precious spice that, according to Matthew's Gospel, the wise men had brought to her son when he was a baby in Bethlehem. Myrrh at his birth, and myrrh at his burial. The gift that bookended his life. Whether Mary consciously remembered it in that terrible hour, we cannot know. But the same fragrance that had filled the house where the Magi knelt before her infant now filled the tomb where they laid his body. Now picture Mary in all of this. The men handled the body, but Jewish custom placed the women at the heart of mourning and burial preparation. Mary and the other women would have been there as the body was taken down, as it was carried the short distance to the tomb, as the linen was prepared. The tomb itself belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. It was brand new, carved into the rock, never used. It was nearby, in a garden close to the place of execution. There was no time to take the body anywhere else. The Sabbath was minutes away, and so, in a terrible rush against the setting sun, the body of Jesus was wrapped in linen with the spices and laid on the stone shelf inside the tomb. Here is a detail the Gospels are careful to record. The women, Mary among them, watched exactly where he was laid. Luke says they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Mark says Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, saw where he was laid. Why does that small detail matter? Because they were already planning to come back. The burial had been done in such a frantic hurry that the women felt it was incomplete, not enough spices properly applied, not the full loving care a body deserved. They intended to return after the Sabbath to finish it properly. They did not know they would never get the chance. They did not know the tomb would be empty. In their minds, this was simply a burial cut short, and they would be back in 2 days to do it right. And then the stone was rolled across the entrance, a great wheel of rock sealing the tomb. The light inside went out, And on the other side of that stone, in the last gray moments before sunset, stood a mother who had just sealed her son in a grave. The sun went down. The Sabbath began. And everything had to stop. Where did she go that night? The Gospel of John gives us the answer in a single line spoken from the cross. As Jesus was dying, he had looked down at his mother and at the disciple John beside her and said, "Woman, behold your son." And to John, "Behold your mother." And John records, from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. So Mary did not spend that first night alone. She went to John's lodging in Jerusalem. And almost certainly, the other women came too. The close circle who had stood at the cross together. Mary Magdalene, Mary the wife of Clopas, Salome, the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and cared for the group out of their own means. Picture that room. A handful of people who, just a week earlier, had walked into Jerusalem behind a man the crowds were calling a king. Now they sat in the dark, in shock, grieving, and, let us be honest about what the Gospels tell us, afraid. The authorities had killed their teacher. Were they next? The doors were locked, and in the middle of that frightened, broken little group sat his mother. What does a mother feel in the first night after burying her child? There is a particular cruelty to the first night. The body is doing strange things, exhaustion crashing against the impossibility of sleep. The mind keeps reaching for the person and finding them gone, over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she would have seen the hill, the cross, the blood, the linen, the stone. And there was something else. Something the other mourners in that room did not carry. But she did. Because Mary alone knew the whole story. She alone had kept all these things in her heart for 33 years. The angel, the shepherds, Simeon's warning, the strange boy in the temple. She alone had been told, before he was even born, that this child was the Son of God. So in that dark room, she would have been wrestling with the most agonizing question a believing heart can ask. If he was who the angel said he was, how could this happen? If God's own promise was true, where was God now? The Gospels do not record her words that night. Perhaps there were none. Sometimes grief is past words. But everything we know about this woman, the girl who said, "Let it be to me according to your word," the mother who kept all these things and pondered them in her heart, tells us that even in that darkness, she did not let go. She held on. She waited. She did the one thing she had done her entire life. She trusted, even when she could not see. And there is one more thing worth saying about that first night. In the ancient Jewish world, the first stage of mourning was intense and physical. Mourners tore their garments. They sat low, on the ground or on low stools. They covered their heads. They did not wash, did not anoint themselves, did not greet others in the ordinary way. The whole body entered grief. So picture that room more fully now. Not a quiet, composed sorrow, but the raw, ancient shape of grief, torn cloth, bowed heads, the low keening that has no words. And in the middle of it, the mother. The one whose loss was deepest. The one around whom the others would have gathered, because in that culture, the mother of the dead held the very center of the mourning. And yet, even here, something set her apart from the others' grief. They mourned a future that had died with him, the kingdom they had hoped for, the teacher they had followed. But Mary mourned something both smaller and infinitely larger. Her child, the specific, irreplaceable person she had made and raised. No theology softens that. The Mother of God was, that night, simply a mother who had lost her son. And slowly, the first terrible night passed. and the gray light of the Sabbath morning came. Saturday, the Sabbath, the whole of it. And this is the day no one talks about. Friday has the cross. Sunday has the resurrection. But Saturday is the silent day, the day in between, the day when nothing happened, when nothing could happen, when her son was simply dead and in the ground, and the world stood still. Understand what the Sabbath meant. From sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, observant Jews did no work of any kind. You did not cook. You did not travel beyond a short distance. You did not labor. You did not even tend to the dead. The burial spices the women wanted to bring, they could not. The body they wanted to care for, they could not touch it. Everything had to wait. So Mary spent the longest day of her life unable to do the one thing every grieving mother aches to do: be near her child, tend to him, care for his body. She could not even go to the tomb. She had to sit still all day in a locked room with her grief. Have you ever had a day like that? A day when something unbearable has happened, and there is simply nothing you can do about it, and you have to just wait for the hours to pass? That was Mary's entire Saturday, stretched across the longest, emptiest day of her life. But let us think carefully about what was happening inside her, because this is the heart of the whole story. Every other person in that room was grieving a dead teacher, a dead friend, a dead leader whose movement had just been crushed. Their grief was real, but it was the grief of an ending. As far as they understood, it was over. The dream was dead. They were already, quietly, beginning to think about how to go back to their old lives in Galilee. But Mary was not grieving an ending. Or at least, part of her could not fully believe it was one. Because she remembered things the others had forgotten or never known. She remembered the angel's exact words. "He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High, and of his kingdom there will be no end." No end. She remembered that her son himself had said, more than once, strange things about being killed and rising again on the third day. The others had not understood it. Maybe she had not fully understood it either. But she remembered it. And so, on that silent Saturday, while everyone around her grieved an ending, a small, impossible, flickering question must have lived in the heart of his mother. The same heart that had said yes to an angel when she was a frightened teenager. What if it is not over? And consider the contrast in that room more sharply. Around her sat men who, just days before, had walked into Jerusalem expecting thrones. Peter, who had sworn he would die before denying his master, and then denied him 3 times before the rooster crowed, and was now drowning in shame. The others, who had scattered into the dark when the soldiers came. They were not only grieving, they were ashamed, afraid and lost. Their teacher was dead, their courage had failed, and their hope was buried behind a stone. And in the middle of these broken, frightened men sat a woman who had never once failed in her faith, who had not denied him, who had not fled, who had stood at the cross to the end. If anyone in that room was holding the others together by the sheer steadiness of her trust, it was the mother. She had less reason than any of them to hope. She had lost more than any of them, and yet she was the steadiest soul in the room. She had no proof. She had no way to know. She had only a lifetime of trusting a God who kept impossible promises. And so she held on, through the longest and most silent day of her life, to a hope she could not explain and dared not say out loud. And consider what the rest of that day actually held, hour by hour. the morning light moving slowly across the floor, the other mourners coming and going in their grief, the ordinary needs of the body, hunger she could not feel, thirst she ignored, the exhaustion of a second day without real rest. Outside, the muffled sounds of a city at Sabbath rest, going about its holy day as if the world had not ended. And inside her, the slow, circling thoughts of a grieving mind. Replaying the cross, replaying his words, replaying 33 years of memory. Have you ever noticed how grief distorts time? How an hour can feel like a day, and a day can feel like a year? That Saturday must have stretched out endlessly for her. Each hour its own small eternity of waiting. And there was nothing she could do to make it pass faster or to ease the weight of it. She could only endure it. And the long gray Sabbath wore on toward evening. At last, the sun began to set on Saturday. And as the first 3 stars appeared in the evening sky, the Sabbath was officially over. Work could be done again. The world could move again. And the very first thing the women did, the moment they were allowed, was begin to prepare. Mark's gospel tells us precisely, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. As soon as the shops could open on Saturday night, they bought what they needed. They spent that evening preparing the spices and ointments to finish the burial they had been forced to leave incomplete on Friday. Picture these women that Saturday night, working by lamplight, grinding the myrrh, mixing the ointments, preparing to do with their own hands the last loving act they could do for the body of the man they loved. It was the only thing left they could give him, and they were going to give it properly. Was Mary among them? The Gospels name different women in the group that would go to the tomb at dawn, and his mother is not always named in the dawn party itself. Perhaps the others insisted the grieving mother rest. Perhaps she was simply too broken to make the pre-dawn walk. But she was certainly there that Saturday evening in the circle of women preparing, in the small community of grief that was getting ready to say its final goodbye. And here we should pause and honor something. Through this entire story, who stayed? Who did not run? Who did not hide? The women. At the cross, it was the women and one young disciple. At the burial, the women watched where he was laid. On Saturday night, the women prepared the spices. At dawn on Sunday, it would be the women who walked to the tomb first. The men, for the most part, were behind locked doors, afraid. But the women, led in spirit by the mother of Jesus, kept doing the work of love. Grief did not paralyze them. It focused them. They could not stop the death, but they could honor the body, and they would. They finished their preparations late that night. The spices were ready. The plan was simple. They would rise before dawn, while it was still dark, and walk to the tomb at first light, as early as the law and the daylight would allow. There was only one problem, and they talked about it that night, worried about it, turned it over among themselves. The stone, that enormous wheel of rock sealing the tomb. It had taken strong men to roll it into place. Mark records the exact worry on their minds as they set out. Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? They were a handful of women carrying jars of spices. They had no way to move it. They decided to go anyway. They would figure out the stone when they got there. Love does not wait for every problem to be solved. They would go, and they would trust that somehow they would find a way in. And so the second night passed. And in the deepest dark before Sunday's dawn, the women rose. It was still dark when they set out. The Gospel of John is specific. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. Think about the courage of this walk. It was dark. The city was dangerous for followers of Jesus. They were walking to the tomb of a man executed by the state, a tomb guarded by Roman soldiers. They were carrying spices to anoint a body. They had no way to move the stone, and they went anyway. Why? Because that is what love does. It shows up, even when it makes no sense, even when there is no reason to hope. The women were not walking to the tomb expecting a miracle. They were walking there to grieve, to finish the burial, to be near him one last time. And as they walked, the sky began, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. The deepest part of the night, that hour when grief is heaviest and hope feels furthest away, was beginning, very slowly, to give way. Now, where was Mary, the mother, in this dawn? The Gospels focus the dawn story on Mary Magdalene and the other women who carried the spices. The mother of Jesus is not named in the dawn walk itself. And there is something deeply human in that. Perhaps the younger, stronger women insisted she stay and rest. Perhaps after 3 days without real sleep, her body simply could not make the walk. Perhaps she was praying alone in the dark room while the others went. But whether she was on the path or waiting in the room, his mother was awake at that dawn. Of that we can be sure. No mother sleeps through the third morning. She was awake and she was waiting for the women to come back, for some word, for the long nightmare of these 3 days to somehow break. And here is the extraordinary thing about that exact moment. Mary did not yet know. None of them knew. As they walked through the dark, as she sat by the window, the most important event in human history had, according to the Gospels, already happened in the silence, with no human eye to see it. Sometime in that dark before dawn, inside the sealed and guarded tomb, the stone still in place, no trumpet, no crowd, no witness. Life had returned. But Mary and the women did not know that yet. They were still inside the grief, still carrying their spices, still asking who would roll the stone away. The dawn of the most joyful morning in history was breaking over people who still believed, with every step, that they were walking toward a corpse. And this is one of the most tender truths in the whole account. For a few more minutes, the mother of Jesus still lived inside the worst grief of her life, not knowing that it was already over. The victory had already been won in the silent dark, but the news had not yet reached her. She was, in those final minutes before dawn, a grieving mother on the very edge of the greatest joy any human being would ever receive. And she did not know it yet. How often is that true for all of us? That the answer is already on its way, while we are still in the dark? That the thing we are desperate for has already been set in motion, and we simply have not heard yet. Mary lived that in the most literal way imaginable, in the gray minutes of that Sunday dawn. And then the women reached the garden, and they looked up, and they stopped. The stone was not where it should have been. The stone, the enormous wheel of rock that none of them could move, had been rolled away. The tomb was open, and the women stood frozen at the entrance of an open grave. Mark tells us that as they entered, they saw a young man in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he spoke to them the words that split history in two. Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. He is not here. The spices in their hands were suddenly useless. There was no body to anoint. The thing they had spent all of Saturday night preparing for, the thing they had walked through the dark and the danger to do, was unnecessary. Because the tomb was empty. Now imagine the news reaching the mother. The Gospels describe the women running from the tomb in a storm of fear and joy, running to tell the disciples. And somewhere in that morning, The news reached the locked room where his mother had waited out the longest 3 days of her life. The women, breathless, weeping, barely able to speak. The tomb is empty. The stone is rolled away. He is not there. They say he is alive. What did she feel in that instant? After everything? After the cross, the burial, the sealed stone, the silent Sabbath, the sleepless nights? After holding on to an impossible flicker of hope, she could not even say out loud. We are not told her exact words. But think about who this woman was. She was the one who, more than anyone on earth, had been prepared for this. She had carried the secret of who he was since before he was born. She had treasured every impossible promise in her heart for 33 years. While everyone else had grieved an ending, some deep and faithful part of her had never fully stopped waiting for God to do the impossible. And now the impossible had happened. The promise had held. The God who told a teenage girl in Nazareth that nothing would be impossible for him had just proven it in the most total way conceivable. Her son was alive. And think about the perfect, almost unbearable symmetry of it. 33 years earlier, Mary's journey with this son had begun in a different kind of darkness. A cave in Bethlehem at night, where she laid a newborn in a manger because there was no room anywhere else. It began in a borrowed, humble place, in the dark, with only a few witnesses. And now it had come full circle. A borrowed tomb in the dark, with only a few faithful women. And out of that darkness, life again. The cave where he was born and the tomb where he was buried were, in the end, both just doorways. One into the world, and one back out of death. The 3 days were over. The 60 hours of darkness, silence, and waiting were finished. And the mother who had stood at the cross when everyone else fled, who had sealed her son in a tomb against the setting sun, who had endured the longest silent Sabbath of her life, holding on to a thread of impossible hope. That mother now stood in the morning light and learned that everything she had ever believed was true. Her yes. The yes she had spoken to an angel as a frightened girl. The yes she had held on to through every sword that pierced her soul had not been in vain. He was risen. Step back and look at what these 3 days actually were. We remember the cross. We remember the resurrection. We build our whole faith on those 2 mountain peaks. But between them lies a valley that almost no one ever walks through. The 3 days when the story seemed over. When the answer had not come yet. When all a grieving mother could do was wait in the dark. And that is exactly why these 3 days matter so much. Because most of life is not lived on the mountain peaks. Most of life is lived in the valley in between, in the waiting, in the silence, in the Saturday. When Friday's grief is real and Sunday's joy has not come yet, and you simply have to hold on without being able to see how it ends. Mary lived that Saturday, the longest, most silent day. She had no proof the morning was coming. She only had a lifetime of trusting a God who keeps his promises, even when every visible sign says the story is over. And every person who has ever sat in a hospital waiting room, every parent who has buried a child, every soul who has prayed into a silence that gave no answer, everyone who has had to keep believing through the long Saturday between the loss and the hope, every one of them is walking the same 3 days Mary walked. She shows us how to do it, not by pretending the grief away. She grieved fully at the foot of the cross in the dark room through the silent day. But underneath the grief, she never let go of the thread. She kept treasuring the promise in her heart the way she always had. She waited. She trusted. She endured the silence. And on the 3rd day, the silence broke. Think about how many people across 2,000 years have needed exactly this story. The ones sitting in their own Saturday right now. The mother whose child is in surgery and the clock will not move. The person who prayed for years and heard nothing. The one who buried someone last week and woke up this morning into the unbearable, ordinary silence of a world that kept turning. Every one of them is living a version of Mary's Saturday. And the reason her 3 days matter so much is that she shows us the silence is survivable. That you can grieve fully and still hold the thread of hope. That you do not have to understand how the story ends in order to keep trusting the one who is writing it. Mary did not skip the Saturday. She lived every hour of it, and then the morning came anyway. That is what these 3 days show us. That the silence is not the end of the story. That Saturday, however long it lasts, is not the final word. That the God who kept his promise to a grieving mother in Jerusalem keeps his promises still. If this gave you a new way to see Mary, and a new way to see your own waiting, subscribe. Because we tell the quiet, human stories behind the moments everyone thinks they already know. Tell me in the comments, what part of these 3 days moved you most? The moment she sealed the tomb against the setting sun? The longest silent Saturday? Or the morning the news finally reached her that he was alive? I read every comment. Thank you for walking these 3 days with me. I'll see you in the next one.